So I want to say a little bit about the structure of deductive and inductive arguments, especially deductive arguments, as it relates back to the stuff we did on argument diagramming. I don't have a lot to say, but Lavin talks about this, and he talks about it really quickly. It goes, it's one of those blink if you miss it kind of things. But I think this is important to say how it relates to that. Now, in deductive arguments, the conclusion will either directly flow from one premise, or more commonly, you'll have conjoint support. Strictly speaking, deductive arguments will not have multiple premises that provide independent support. Now, why is that? Well, in a valid deductive argument, you don't really need to do that because one line of argument should be enough, right? When you see multiple premises providing independent support that each make the conclusion more likely, that's a mark of inductive arguments, right? One premise, let's say our conclusion is 30% likely. One premise might make it 45%. Another might push that up to 60. Another might push that up to 90, right? That is very much a mark of inductive arguments. Now, what some people will sometimes do, and lawyers do this a lot, attorneys do this a lot, is to provide multiple deductive arguments for the same conclusion. Now, why might you do this? If each of your deductive arguments is valid, then each of them on its own ought to establish the conclusion with certainty, right? Well, you do it because the premises in one argument might turn out to be false, right? And if they do, you have a backup argument or arguments. Here's an example. The defendant's contract says that she must answer the client's emails or text messages in 72 hours. If she doesn't, she's in breach of contract. She did not answer the client's emails and text messages in 72 hours. It also says she has to use real Apple replacement parts. Let's imagine she does computer repair of some sort, right? In her repairs, and if she does not, she is in breach of contract. She did not use real Apple parts in the repairs. Therefore, the defendant is in breach of contract. Now look, you could actually put this argument as two different arguments, right? Has to respond to emails in 72 hours. She didn't, breach of contract. Has to use real Apple parts. She didn't, breach of contract, right? But, you can also just put this as one long argument. You can picture the attorney suing this woman saying, well, if she doesn't answer the calls, text 72 hours, she's breached her contract. She didn't. She doesn't use real Apple parts. She's breached her contract. She didn't. Therefore, Your Honor, on these multiple grounds, the defendant is in breach of contract, right? So literally, technically, the attorney's giving us two deductive arguments here, each of which should be enough to establish its own conclusion. But if you're diagramming these, you could treat it like this. 1 and 2 support 5. 3 and 4 also support 5. Why is the attorney doing this? If the defendant says, well, actually, he says I didn't, but I have proof here of all the text messages I always answered. Well, maybe 1 and 2 go by the wayside. You don't have that anymore. But 3 and 4, that she didn't use the real Apple parts, that's in her contract, would be enough to show, she's in breach of contract. So you kind of do this, and the reason attorneys do it is just good practice. It's butt covering. Each line of argument should be enough to establish the conclusion, but just in case, give multiple, really good attorneys, if they can, might give like 5 different deductive arguments why they should win. The judge might not like the premises in 4 of them, but they just need 1 to work, right? So if either of these sets of conjoint premises work, each on its own is enough to show the conclusion's true. If one goes by the wayside, the others would still be enough to show 100%. This is a valid argument. It's true. Now think of this Laura argument I gave you earlier. She's young and healthy. Young and healthy people unlikely to get severely ill if they get COVID. She's been vaccinated. People who have been vaccinated are less likely to severely get ill if they get COVID. She's unlikely to get severely ill if she does get COVID. Superficially, we can treat this inductive argument as having the same structure. But notice what happens here if we knock out one line of argument, right? In the deductive, it's enough to establish this with 100% certainty. It's valid. Either line of argument's true, the conclusion has to be true as well. So if we knock out 1 and 2, 3 and 4, still enough to show definitely our conclusion is true. With our inductive argument, though, if we knock out 1 and 2, we might say, well, she's fully vaccinated and she's young and healthy. Sorry, if we knock out 3 and 4, well, if we find out she's not vaccinated, she's young and healthy, means she's unlikely to get ill, but the percentage chance that she would get ill goes up if she hasn't had the shot, right? So here, knocking out one line of independent argument makes the chances in an inductive argument that the conclusion is false go up a bit. In a deductive argument, as long as we've got one line of argument that works, we've established the conclusion just as well as if we have 10. In an inductive, each line of argument we knock out probably makes the chances that the conclusion is true a little lower. So that's an important difference, even though these two, the structure looks superficially alike. And generally, in deductive arguments, more commonly, you really won't see independent premises at all. Lawyers will do this sometimes. Politicians, people making arguments from moral principles will too, but it's really just kind of like covering your butt. If one line of deductive argument works, you really don't need to do this. All right, hopefully that makes sense. Hopefully that will do a little bit to connect this back, the stuff we've been talking about on argument diagramming.